I think a lot of people got into the watch collecting hobby recently, and whether you're a beginner or a veteran, I think this would be a fun way to reminisce and kind of see where you land in the tiers of enthusiasm. I love it when new people come in, and I love sharing this hobby with my family and friends. Overall, the community is super positive, and there are a couple bad apples, but mostly the watch community is a really fun place to be. One more thing to know is that we are going to be talking about watch enthusiasm, not necessarily watch collecting, and this is really just to keep us from going into the territory of saying you have to spend this much money on watches and you have to have this many watches in your collection. If we talked about that in that way, I think it'd be a lot less fun. And so this way, no matter where you are financially speaking, you can still enjoy this video. Make sure you like and subscribe, and starting with number 1 is the blossoming tier. This is the easiest one to get into and the easiest one to leave. Sadly, some people just don't catch the bug. Usually they start out by seeing a celebrity wearing a watch and it kind of catches their eye. Maybe a family friend or someone bought a watch and they noticed it through osmosis. For me personally, I watched a video when I was about 15 or so that said 10 things every man needs, and a watch was on there. The watches in the video caught my eye, and I eventually went down the YouTube rabbit hole. I found TGV at the Urban Gentry, and then I found Teddy Balthazar, and I was instantly hooked. I know recently that the pandemic had also sparked a lot of interest in this hobby, mostly because a ton of people had a bunch of money that they couldn't spend on vacations, and they were kind of bored, so they were shopping online. We saw the prices rise a bunch, and it was almost like a trend to get into watches. A lot of people got stuck at this tier, unfortunately. But just because you do a deep dive search and you see a bunch of videos and learn a bunch about it doesn't mean that you're going to become a full-blown enthusiast. In this stage, you really just have to have some level of interest in watches and be aware that people actually spend their money on this and they enjoy it. It's important to note that at this stage, you don't have to spend your own money on watches, and you don't even have to have any watches yet. If you made it past that stage, then now you are in our second tier, which is the beginner tier. And in this tier, you probably made it out of the rabbit hole, and now you're fully interested in watches. If you own a watch, you jump to being a beginner enthusiast, and this is mostly because watches are seen as a luxury item nowadays. You have your phones and you have your wall clocks. Watches just really aren't necessary, and so a majority of people do use them as some sort of jewelry or a status symbol, or even us enthusiasts, we just use it as a way to show what we're interested in. And so no, I'm not going to be flexing on anyone with this Nevada Grenchen, but people who see it will know, okay, well, that dude, maybe he's interested in watches. I mean, I feel like if you're wearing Nevada Grenchen, you're not really kind of a hype boy. You're probably into more toolish, cool looking, interesting pieces, or at least that's what I like to think. That's the message I'm trying to give out. My logic is that if you spend your own money that you work hard on and that you could have spent for other hobbies or other necessities, and you spend it on a watch, I believe that you're a beginner enthusiast. But it's actually important to note that not all people who spend money on watches are technically beginner enthusiasts. I know a bunch of people who just start making a bunch of money and they're like, oh, let me go buy a Rolex Datejust, and then that's the only watch they get, and they don't even know it's automatic. They just know if they set it down, it'll stop working. If you can tell me why your watch is either a quartz watch or an automatic watch, you're definitely in this tier. It really depends on the type of person you are, but you've probably started commenting on forums online. You've probably started commenting on YouTube videos and kind of learning about watches through talking with other people. One last thing I'll mention is in the beginner phase, there's a 99% chance you own a watch. It's not a requirement by any means, but watches have such a low barrier to entry. Unlike the car hobby, where the barrier to entry is a couple thousand, the watches have a very relatively low barrier to entry. You can get a really good watch for 20 bucks. I mean, there's the Casio A158, that's super iconic, super popular. There's even the less popular Casio Royale that's really cool too. And if you go up $50, you can even get a Timex or maybe like a Casio Duro. The point is you don't have to spend an arm and a leg to get into watch collecting. We'll leave it at the fact that you don't have to spend money to be an enthusiast, but if you are very enthusiastic about watches, chances are you've already picked up your first piece. Now as you get more serious, you make it into the third stage, which is the amateur stage. This is where the hobby gets a little bit more serious. I'm not one to gatekeep people, but this is the stage where if you're putting more of your own time, your own effort into learning more about something, then that should be gatekeeped. You're definitely at a different level if you're here than someone who is just buying 5 different Quartz Invictas. You definitely know a little bit more about what you're doing, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it affects your buying choices, because there's so many other things you can do in this stage. You should definitely own a watch in this stage, and I'm going to go one step further and say it has to be a mechanical watch. And that's not to say that quartz doesn't have its place. This is really just to keep people who buy mass amounts of quartz fashion watches out of the amateur phase. When I say automatic, I don't mean that you have to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on one. Before COVID, it was a lot easier to find these watches, but for now, you can definitely find like a Broderie or a Seiko low, like a pre-owned one, under $100. And if you want to go up just to $200 even, you can find Orient, you can find other really great brands that are automatic. So you don't need to spend a bunch of money to be in this hobby. This is also the stage where you start to share your enthusiasm, and it's probably going to start with you telling your friends and your family, probably your parents, and they're going to look at you, and maybe they'll be super supportive like mine were, or maybe they'll look at you like you're crazy, and you know, you just have to roll the dice on that one. But eventually you will learn that it is way more fun to talk to people who are already interested in watches than try to convince your family members that they should be interested in it. This is probably the stage that you stop exclusively commenting online and you try to find people in real life to meet up with and talk about watches. I personally have never been to an in real life watch meetup, but I will say that for me it was a watch shop. So I had a watch shop. I was lucky that was more enthusiast based, and I had a guy that could really show me about watches, about vintage watches. He was super knowledgeable, and he even let me borrow a couple. I met some of his friends who are also into watches, and I learned a lot from his boss, who was super knowledgeable. If you're already working on watches or modding them, congrats, you're an amateur enthusiast. You're definitely at least in this stage. Even if you're just buying or checking out books from your local library or shop, I mean, that's a great way to learn about watches. This is a book I have in the background. It's a really good book to read and learn about watches. This book even has color in it. Something like this book would be really cool to have, even if you didn't own a watch yet. Another thing you could pick up, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but when you go to a watch shop, usually they'll give you a little book. And so this one's from Richard Mille. I obviously couldn't buy a Richard Mille at this moment, but they gave me a book to learn about the history and all the different models. And this is definitely one way to kind of get into the hobby. If that's, I mean, this is technically the most free way to get into the watch hobby and start learning, is to go to one of those brands and just pick up a free book. I would not recommend it necessarily, but sometimes they'll give it to you. I think it's really important to highlight books and highlight modding watches, highlight other parts of watch collecting and watch enthusiasm, because you don't necessarily have to own a huge collection and even spend a ton of money to be really into watches. Seriously, I know I keep repeating myself, but you do not need to own a luxury watch in order to be a watch enthusiast. It's just not a criteria in my opinion. Hell, if you're one of those people who just collects a bunch of San Martins, that is a level of enthusiasm. It's not my level of enthusiasm, but hey, it's definitely a part of the hobby. But let's move on to number 4, and this one is intermediate. This is where you start to get even more serious about the hobby. And in my opinion, this is where you stop being more of a spectator and you really start becoming more active in this hobby. Now, this is when you start to bring your own watches to meetups. This is when you can fully service a movement. This is when you start making videos online about watches. I'm not saying that you have to do all of these things, but this is really the stage where you branch out and you find what you are interested in. You don't have to do anything or everything in this hobby, and I know specifically from my friend, he can fully service a chronograph movement, but he would never post a video online about watches. And I love making videos online about watches, but I don't have the patience and I don't really want to learn how to service a movement. I would just give it to him to service or pay someone else to do it. Also, I'm not really a watch meetup type of guy. I've never been to one. I don't know if there are any around me, but for me personally, I try to be active online, and I do meet people at the watch shop I go to, but I've never gone to an actual meetup. If you didn't know, I'm currently in school right now. That's my associate's degree. I'm going to be going to get my bachelor's degree. I have 2 jobs I'm working. I'm a real estate agent, and I have another job that I picked up for extra money. And after all that, I also do my YouTube on the side. And so that's to say that you only have so much time on your hand, and so you really have to pick what part of the hobby you want to be a part of. You can't do everything and anything. If you only have so much time to dedicate to this hobby, it makes sense that you would niche down and try to pick your own path. It makes sense that you would pick something and be really good at it rather than trying to be good at every little thing, just like mediocre at it. I definitely don't think you need to be the best at everything to enjoy the hobby, and you definitely don't need to post videos online like I do. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying, like, there are so many other parts of this hobby you can enjoy, and there are things that I haven't even discovered yet, and so I always like to keep my mind open, even if this is kind of the thing that I've settled on. And finally, I really want to emphasize the fact that makes this tier is mostly being active in your community. It means commenting on forums. It means commenting regularly when it comes to YouTube videos, so comment on this video. But I am going to own up and say, for the longest time, I did not comment on people's videos. I didn't even like them. You know, I would watch all these YouTube videos and I just wouldn't even really support the creators. But now, after doing it myself, I realize how much work goes into it, and I've made sure I'm subscribed. I try to like everyone else's videos, and I try to comment supportive things on theirs, because it really is, it takes a lot to make these videos, and I'm really glad that they make them so I can watch them, and I hope that you enjoy these videos so you can watch these. This video is just meant to be a ton of fun and not necessarily gatekeeping, but for this 5th tier, the veteran tier, there is a little bit of a gate that's stopping most people. These are the people who are maxing out their enthusiasm in one section. So these are the people that can fully service movements. These are the type of people who don't miss their watch meetups. If they're weekly, they go every week. I'm not really sure how those work. I haven't been to one. If they're making YouTube videos, they are the type to be uploading consistently and commenting regularly. If they're collecting watches, these are the type of people who have varied collections with lots of different brands. If they do only collect one brand, it's usually with a purpose. So let's say you're collecting only vintage Rolex Submariners. So you might have some with sword hands, you might have the Comex dials, you're gonna have the friction fit bezels and the ratcheting bezels. And then in that way, you are varied, but you have the exact same watch, just a ton of different variations of it. For me personally, that is not a fun way to collect. I like to wear my watches. But for those people who have that kind of money and they just want to fill out their collection with every variant of it, I think that's super cool. You definitely see a lot more of that in the Pokemon card space, but because of how expensive watches are, I don't really see much of that in the watch collecting space. Veterans are also going to be people who have deepened their knowledge. So they're going to know a lot more about independent brands, micro brands. They're going to have a deep knowledge of the different groups, so they're going to know what the Swatch group is. They're going to know what brands are in the Richemont group, and I don't even know what are in the Richemont group. I know that Swatch group consists mostly of Omega, Swatch, and Longines. See, I can't even think of them all. Like, I almost thought that Oris was one of them, but I remember Oris is a independent brand. Anyways, there are some veterans that become watch salesmen. My personal shop I go to is Cool Vintage Watches in Parkville, Missouri. Those people are watch enthusiasts, but they're also salesmen. There is one in Chicago I really like. The one when I go to Chicago, I go to Seidel and Seidel, and I shop with Jonathan. Seidel and Seidel is a little family-run store. It has Jonathan, and then there's a lady in there, and then there's his dad. And I personally think that Jonathan's really smart. He's really enthusiastic about watches. He knows a lot about Nomos. I think he has some good connections. I'd recommend them as well. And one more that I haven't been to, but I have heard, is that Max from Watch Crunch recommends the Timeworks in Seattle. He says that they are enthusiasts, and so if I'm ever in Seattle, that's the one I'm going to stop by. I don't know where else to put this, but I don't think I'm a veteran yet. I don't think that I know enough about watch brands. I'm still working on being vocal about my opinions as a watch enthusiast. I definitely don't know the first thing about removing a movement to service it, and I say all this to tell you that it's okay not to make it to certain levels of enthusiasm. I personally have never made it past the beginner stage of car enthusiasm, and this is because I can't afford or just don't want to spend the money for an extra project car. I have some knowledge of different car brands and different car models, but I typically drive my little 10-year-old Toyota, and it has over 100,000 miles on it, and I'm pretty happy with it. For me, I'm totally okay with staying at that level of enthusiasm for cars, and if you're okay where you're at in the level of watch enthusiasm, that's okay too. There are just so many other priorities in life that come before watches that if you do make it to the veteran stage, it's almost a little weird. You know, you have to be dedicated to get to this stage. The amount of veteran enthusiasts are a very, very minuscule amount of watch owners, and I definitely don't think that most people will make this stage. Because there's so few of them, I think that they're a much tighter group. They tend to be more friendly to everyone, and for me personally, I found that the veterans are usually really friendly to newcomers, and they want people to learn more about the hobby. They're not gatekeepers at all. My experience was with my friend Ryan. Before I bought an expensive luxury watch, he would let me borrow like more affordable ones, and he would let me wear them and kind of get the experience, so I knew which watches I liked and which ones I didn't. And that was really awesome of him to do that. Most people just don't have that opportunity. There is probably another level of enthusiasm, but I just haven't made it there yet. Notice how I didn't mention Rolex at all in this video, and it's because liking or hating Rolex doesn't make you any more or less of an enthusiast. That's just simple-minded stuff. I hope you liked this video. It actually came from one of my favorite creators, Bladed Angel, in the car community. I normally don't ask for people to share, but for this type of video, it is important to share so we can get more people in this hobby. And so if you could, that'd be great. If you liked the video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.